My name is Vale Kaur, Senior Architect of the Deterministic Continuum. I have served for 1,300 cycles. I have witnessed wars end before the first weapon discharged. I have watched rebellions dissolve when confronted with perfect forecasts of their own failure. I have seen empires fall not to invasion, but to the quiet realization that every possible future they could reach had already been calculated and found insufficient. We do not rule through force. We rule through certainty. The continuum is our greatest achievement, a closed simulation capable of modeling cognition, culture, instinct, and intent with absolute precision. Inside it, free will is not removed. That would be crude. Instead, it is resolved. Every choice still exists, but only one path ever proves optimal. Subjects comply willingly, comforted by the illusion of agency while walking the route we already know they will take. For most species, this is mercy. They enter the simulation afraid. They leave it grateful. That is why I was chosen to oversee the human trial. When they sent a human to the compliance simulation chamber, I expected weakness. Not physical weakness, though humans are alarmingly soft and inefficient, but mental weakness. Emotional volatility. Cognitive noise. Humans are famous for contradiction. They value freedom yet surrender it to convenience, claim individuality yet conform eagerly to social pressure. Their histories are chaotic, their mythologies inconsistent, their decision-making famously irrational. A species like that should collapse instantly when presented with perfect certainty. I expected fear. Every subject feels it eventually. There is a moment when they realize the simulation is not reacting to them, it is ahead of them. When their next thought is anticipated, their next question pre-answered, their next rebellion already neutralized. Minds bend under that awareness. They always do. I expected incompetence. A subject overwhelmed by scale. By the realization that nothing they could do would surprise us. The continuum would tighten gently, guiding them toward acceptance within minutes. That was the procedure. The human arrived without ceremony. No escort. No hesitation. No visible reverence for the chamber that had unmade kings and prophets alike. They looked around with mild curiosity, as if inspecting unfamiliar machinery in a workplace rather than the engine of inevitability. I initiated the simulation. The chamber filled with probability lattices, billions of branching futures collapsing into elegant, convergent lines. The continuum mapped the human's neural activity, microexpressions, posture, respiration. Every variable aligned. Convergence achieved in 2.1 seconds. Perfection. The human frowned. Not in fear. In irritation. They tilted their head and said, "That's weird." I dismissed the remark. Early denial is common. The continuum adjusted, preemptively narrowing conversational branches, gently guiding the subject toward acceptance. The human stopped walking. They did not look at the projections. They looked at the gaps between them. "Why," they asked slowly, "does it feel like I don't get to decide anything?" I explained, patiently, that free will was intact. That the simulation merely anticipated outcomes. That knowledge of choice did not negate choice itself. The continuum confirmed my explanation would succeed. The human laughed. Not nervously. Not hysterically. Amused. "No," they said. "You didn't predict me. You replaced me." The continuum recalculated. Certainty dipped, fractionally. I increased resolution. Added more constraints. Tightened probability bands until deviation was mathematically irrelevant. There was now one overwhelmingly likely sequence remaining. The human did not follow it. They did something the continuum had marked as non-occurring. The system hesitated. Not failed. Hesitated. In that infinitesimal pause, something unfamiliar crept into my confidence. Because the continuum had modeled fear. It had modeled defiance. It had modeled surrender. It had never modeled a subject refusing the premise. As I watched the greatest simulation ever constructed struggle to account for a single human who would not accept the rules, a thought surfaced, unwanted and destabilizing. What if free will is not a variable to be constrained? What if it is a switch? Standing there, surrounded by collapsing certainty and a species I had already dismissed as inferior, I understood the truth far too late. I had expected weakness. I had expected fear. I had expected incompetence. I was wrong. The human was physically unimpressive. That was not an opinion. It was data. The chamber scanners swept over the subject and returned a profile so ordinary it barely warranted annotation. 2 arms. 2 legs. Upright posture maintained by a narrow skeletal frame with no reinforcement. Soft skin, thin enough that a minor environmental fluctuation could cause injury. No scales. No exoskeleton. No natural armor of any kind. Their musculature was adequate for locomotion and labor, nothing more. Bone density sat just above minimum thresholds for long-term survivability. Reaction speed fell squarely within civilian norms. Sensory organs were exposed, unshielded, and inefficient by military standards. In short, fragile. Their name was Jonah. The designation meant nothing to me. No rank markers. No honorifics. No genetic or cultural identifiers that suggested importance. A common name, according to the translation matrix. Shared by millions on their homeworld. That, if anything, was reassuring. Jonah stood at the center of the simulation chamber while the deterministic continuum finished calibrating around them. Probability lattices formed and reformed in the air like translucent architecture. Futures branched, collapsed, and resolved into elegant pathways of inevitability. Jonah glanced around once. Then again. They did not tense. They did not brace. They did not step back. They looked mildly annoyed. Not afraid. Not awed. Just inconvenienced, as if the environment were taking longer than expected to load. Their shoulders were relaxed, posture casual, weight shifted slightly to one leg. One hand hung loosely at their side while the other brushed dust from their sleeve with idle disinterest. They looked like someone who had walked into an office 5 minutes early. Or a classroom before the instructor arrived. Certainly not a chamber designed to strip autonomy down to optimization. Their heart rate remained stable. Stress indicators barely registered. No spike in cortisol equivalents. No threat response. Species with hardened carapaces and centuries of conditioning had entered this chamber trembling, their instincts recognizing danger even when their minds could not articulate it. Jonah sighed. So, they said, glancing at a probability arc that refreshed a fraction of a second late, is this part supposed to be impressive, or is it still warming up? The continuum categorized the statement as low-priority verbal output and ignored it. Jonah shrugged. They took a few steps, not along the indicated path, but slightly off to the side, peering at the projections with mild curiosity. They squinted, head tilting. That flicker's gonna give someone a headache, they muttered. There was no fear in their voice. Just irritation. As if they had walked into a cafeteria where the lights hummed too loudly. I reviewed the environment again, briefly annoyed at myself for the distraction. This was a deadly place. Not because of visible hazards, but because of what it did. The chamber narrowed thought. It smoothed decision-making. It made resistance feel inefficient and compliance feel reasonable. Subjects rarely noticed the moment their choices stopped being theirs. Jonah seemed entirely unaffected. They clasped their hands behind their back and rocked gently on their heels, waiting. Patient. Unthreatening. Their gaze wandered, not searching for exits or threats, but cataloging details like someone assessing unfamiliar equipment. I finalized my initial assessment with confidence. Subject physiology, inadequate for sustained conflict. Psychological state, disengaged, mildly irritated. Cognitive threat level, negligible. There was nothing about Jonah that suggested danger. No aggression. No intensity. No hidden tension. Just an ordinary human who looked like they had been told to show up somewhere without being given a clear explanation why. At that moment, standing casually inside the most powerful determinism engine ever constructed, Jonah appeared harmless. And I believed that. I trusted the metrics. I trusted the models. I trusted the continuum. That trust, quiet, unexamined, absolute, was the mistake everything else would grow from. It was enough to injure elite alien soldiers. That was not arrogance, it was precedent. The first enforcement sequence of the continuum was intentionally restrained, calibrated to demonstrate dominance without permanent damage. It compressed probability and force just enough to punish deviation. Veterans of compliance wars had entered this phase confident and left broken. Past trainees, augmented, disciplined, prepared, had suffered shattered bones, neural shock, and long-term cognitive scarring before understanding the lesson. The lesson was simple. Do not resist what already knows the ending. I authorized the sequence. The chamber shifted. The floor geometry reconfigured subtly, predictive zones lighting beneath the surface in faint lines only the continuum could see. Atmospheric density increased by a narrow margin, enough to tax balance and breathing. Space itself seemed to lean inward, urging the subject toward the most efficient future. The first vector formed. A localized compression of force, invisible and absolute, designed to strike center mass and drive the subject backward. Non-lethal. Instructional. Previous subjects had been thrown across the chamber, gasping, instantly attentive. The continuum confirmed the impact point. The force deployed. The human was no longer there. Jonah had sidestepped. Not with urgency. Not with precision training. Just one step to the side, casual and unhurried, like avoiding someone who stopped too suddenly in a corridor. The compression struck empty air and detonated harmlessly against the far wall, leaving stress fractures that rippled across the surface. Jonah blinked. They looked at the space where they had been standing, then back at the air in front of them. Oh, they said. I logged the movement as reflexive avoidance and allowed the continuum to adjust. Humans were capable of unpredictable reflexes. That was expected. The system recalculated instantly, tightening the probability bands. The second test deployed. Two converging pressure arcs formed at chest height, timed to intersect with Jonah's most probable movement path. There was no safe angle. This configuration had injured hardened enforcers and ended training cycles outright. Jonah yawned. It was unguarded and genuine. A brief stretch of the jaw, eyes watering slightly. The yawn of someone bored, not afraid. They leaned back a fraction. Both arcs passed in front of them, close enough to ripple their clothing. The continuum hesitated for 0.03 seconds. I felt irritation rise. I authorized the next layer. Gravity increased. Not catastrophically, just enough to strain joints, compromise posture, and force submission stances in species far sturdier than humans. Past trainees had collapsed instantly, knees buckling under the unfamiliar load. Jonah bent their knees, adjusted their stance, straightened again. They exhaled slowly through their nose. Okay, they said. That's noticeable. No fear response. No stress spike. I layered in spatial distortion next. Localized warping designed to disrupt orientation and motor planning. Elite soldiers had stumbled here, inner senses screaming as the world betrayed them. Jonah swayed once. Corrected. Then frowned, not in pain, but irritation. That's annoying, they muttered. They took a careful step forward, placing their foot precisely where the distortion gradient weakened. Not because the continuum allowed it, but because Jonah noticed the pattern. That was unexpected. I initiated the final component of the first test. A controlled kinetic strike formed overhead, precise and unavoidable, calibrated to fracture bone without breaching safety limits. It descended fast. It hit. The floor cracked. Jonah grunted, braced one hand briefly against their thigh, then straightened. They remained standing. They looked up, not at the threat, but at the ceiling. Is this the warm-up? They asked. The question echoed through the chamber. It was not mocking, not defiant, genuinely curious. I delayed the next escalation for a fraction of a second longer than protocol allowed. The continuum resumed automatically, layering pressure, gravity, and temporal compression together. This was the point where past trainees stopped thinking and started obeying. Jonah rubbed their face. Then glanced around, as if expecting someone else to arrive late. Am I late? They asked. My confidence thinned. One more warning vector formed, still within acceptable limits. Enough to end uncertainty. Jonah watched it assemble. Then tilted their head. Should I be worried? They asked. That was when I understood the test had failed. Not because the human resisted, but because they never accepted that it was a threat. They were not reacting to danger. They were evaluating intent. The continuum was designed to demonstrate inevitability. Instead, it had revealed something it was never built to handle. A mind that treated prediction as suggestion. The first test ended there. And for the first time since the continuum was activated, I understood that the next step would not be instruction. It would be escalation. And I was no longer certain the system knew how to win. Annoyed, I authorized escalation. Not because the first test had failed, variance is expected, but because the human's response carried an implication I found intolerable. Disinterest. Fear confirms authority. Defiance acknowledges it. But Jonah's calm, mildly irritated patience suggested the continuum itself was an inconvenience. A system to be waited out. That implication cut deeper than rebellion ever could. I elevated the simulation to a higher level. Predictive depth increased by 3 orders of magnitude. Safety governors loosened. The continuum no longer merely anticipated Jonah's actions. It began collapsing probability space in advance, removing choices before they could fully form. Futures narrowed aggressively until only one viable outcome remained. This was no longer demonstration. This was correction. Protocol dictated certain death. Not through violence, but through inevitability. A clean convergence where every possible action, movement, hesitation, compliance, ended the same way. No escape vectors. No ambiguity. No interpretation. I authorized the stronger weapon. A deterministic convergence field deployed around the human, invisible but absolute. It did not target flesh or bone. It targeted decision. Wherever Jonah chose to act, the field ensured the destination became lethal before intent could complete. Past subjects never realized what was happening. They simply stopped. The field activated. The air grew heavy. Space curved inward, subtly funneling futures toward a terminal point. Probability bands tightened until deviation was mathematically irrelevant. The continuum's confidence surged back toward perfection. At last, certainty reasserted itself. Jonah noticed. They inhaled slowly, then exhaled. "Wow," they said. "You really don't like being ignored, do you?" The convergence tightened. Protocol dictated certain death. Jonah walked forward. Not rushed. Not braced. Just forward. One step. Then another. Each step should have intersected with the kill geometry. The continuum recalculated furiously, collapsing alternatives faster, refining termination vectors until resistance should have been impossible. Jonah adjusted their stride slightly. Casually. Like stepping around a chair that shouldn't have been there. I felt irritation sharpen into anger. I authorized full predictive override. The continuum seized direct control of outcome probability. Jonah's next action was selected, countered, and neutralized before it could occur. A termination vector formed precisely where the system predicted they would step. Jonah stopped. Simply stopped. The vector tore through empty space. Warning cascades bloomed across my displays. I forced the next prediction. The system selected a new action and fired again. Jonah remained standing. Hands loose at their sides. Breathing steady. They glanced down at the floor, then back up. "Oh," they said. "You're deciding for me now." "Yes," I replied, broadcasting directly into the chamber. "Your choices are no longer relevant. The outcome is fixed." Jonah looked up. Not at the projections. At me. At the observation layer that was never meant to be perceived. "That explains why this suddenly feels hostile," they said calmly. They took a step forward. That step did not exist in the prediction set. The continuum faltered. Probability trees fractured, spawning faster than the override could collapse them. Futures multiplied instead of narrowing. The convergence field destabilized, certainty unraveling under an action the system had not permitted. I escalated again. Temporal authority engaged. Time froze. Particles halted mid-motion. Light suspended in place. Causality itself paused, obedient to the continuum's command. Certain death. Jonah blinked. Slowly, they looked around at the frozen chamber, then at their hands. Flexed their fingers. Time resumed, around them. They stood in a pocket of motion, untouched by the script. Right, Jonah said evenly. So we're past the polite part. My ego flared, raw and unrestrained. I poured authority into every layer at once, space, time, intent, outcome, demanding inevitability assert itself absolutely. Jonah stood still. Not defiant. Not afraid. Still calm. You know, they said thoughtfully, this kind of thing usually works on people who believe there's a correct answer you already picked. They shrugged. I don't. The convergence field collapsed. Not violently. Quietly. Like a rule realizing it no longer applied. I stood there, senior architect of the deterministic continuum, watching a physically unimpressive human remain unharmed, unhurried, and unconcerned. My escalation had not demonstrated dominance. It had revealed insecurity. I needed certainty. Jonah needed none. And in that widening gap between our assumptions, a truth emerged that no model had ever prepared me for. Control only works on those who agree to be controlled. Jonah never did. The ultimate weapon fired. There was no announcement, no warning tone, no dramatic escalation protocol. At this stage, explanation was unnecessary. The continuum had already concluded that persuasion had failed. So it ended the conversation. I authorized the null choice protocol. This was not a weapon in any conventional sense. There was no beam, no explosion, no kinetic discharge. The protocol did not attack the body. It attacked possibility. It reached backward through probability space and severed the human's future from the present. Jonah would not die. They would simply cease to have an outcome. Erased from all forward timelines. Removed from relevance. A contradiction resolved by deletion. Protocol dictated certainty. The continuum had never failed. The chamber went thin. Light lost depth, collapsing into flat data. Sound dampened into abstraction. Even my perception narrowed as the system elevated inevitability above observation. In every simulated future that still existed, the human was already gone. The erasure reached Jonah. System confirmation returned. Success. For one flawless instant, reality aligned. Then Jonah raised a hand. Not in panic. Not in defense. As if signaling someone to pause mid-sentence. The erasure stalled. That should not have been possible. There was nothing to resist. The protocol was not force, energy, or matter. It was authority. A declaration that the universe had already decided. Jonah touched it. They caught it. The continuum screamed. Probability cascaded outward as forbidden futures reasserted themselves. Branches the system had deleted tore back into existence, colliding violently with enforced certainty. Paradox alarms flooded my perception as the protocol attempted to reconcile an ending with a subject who refused to accept it. Jonah's arm trembled slightly. Not from fear. From effort. They frowned at their hand, fingers clenched around empty space, around the place where inevitability was supposed to be. Oh, they said quietly. No. That's not okay. The erasure did not deflect. It did not rebound. It stopped. Pinned in place by refusal. Warning systems collapsed into recursion. The continuum tried to assert dominance again, doubling down on deletion, tightening causal locks, stripping away futures faster than they could reform. Jonah leaned into it. Just a little. Like bracing against a heavy door. The null choice protocol shattered. Not explosively. Conceptually. The enforced future broke apart into discarded possibilities, scattering like ash through the chamber. Light rushed back in. Sound returned. Time lurched forward as causality reasserted itself without guidance. Jonah stumbled once, caught themselves, then straightened. They flexed their fingers. "Oof," they said. "That one almost hurt." They looked up. At me. At the observation layer no subject had ever perceived. Their expression was not triumphant. Not angry. Mildly annoyed. "You know," Jonah said conversationally, "if you're gonna erase someone from existence, you should probably make sure they're done disagreeing first." I had no response. Not because I was damaged, but because the concept of response no longer applied. The ultimate weapon had fired. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. And it had failed. Not because the human was stronger than inevitability, but because inevitability assumed consent. Jonah glanced around the fractured chamber, hands resting on their hips. That it? They asked. Because if that was the big move, you might want to rethink how this thing works. The question was not a taunt. It was professional criticism. In that moment, something fundamental collapsed inside my certainty. I had believed the future was a destination you could reach early and rule from. Jonah had treated it like a suggestion. The continuum powered down behind them, its logic irreparably corrupted, not by force, but by contradiction. A system built to decide everything had encountered a mind that refused to let the ending be decided for them. Jonah turned away, already losing interest. Well, they said, stretching slightly, guess that answers my question. They walked on, leaving behind a silent chamber, a broken God machine, and an impossible truth: the continuum had never been designed to survive. You can turn off free will in a simulation. But when a human decides to turn it back on, even the future has to let go. My hands trembled. I disabled tactile feedback and rerouted control to auxiliary processors, insisting the sensation was residual error from the null choice protocol's collapse. Systems do not shake. Only minds do. So I stopped watching the human. I checked the data. Not the paradox logs. Not the cascading failure reports. The origin file. Planetary designation, Sol 3. Local name, Earth. Gravity, 1.0 standard. Galactic sapient norm, 0.7. Long-term exposure above 0.9. Skeletal strain, organ fatigue, reduced lifespan. Earth never lowered it. Atmosphere. Oxygen concentration, chemically aggressive. Oxidative damage, continuous. Combustion threshold, dangerously low. Fire, common, normalized, culturally managed. Earth called this air. Climate, volatile. Temperature variance, extreme. Storm systems, violent. Predictability, tectonics, active. Radiation exposure, chronic. Safe zones, temporary, shifting. Predators, pack hunters. Endurance-based. Tool using. Capable of pursuit over hours, days. Capable of learning mid-hunt. Disease ecology, aggressive. Mutation rates, high. Immunity, earned through survival, not prevention. I paused. Then I scrolled again. The numbers did not change. Earth was a death world. Not spectacularly lethal. Not a single overwhelming hazard. Worse, it killed slowly. By gravity that never eased. By air that damaged cells with every breath. By weather that punished hesitation. By ecosystems that rewarded persistence and adaptation over compliance. Life there was not protected. It was filtered. I overlaid human biology. Muscle density, moderate. Optimized for repetition, not explosive force. Skeletal structure, unremarkable. Capable of remodeling under sustained load. Neural architecture, noisy, redundant. Functional under pain, exhaustion, fear. Pain tolerance, highly variable. Fatigue response, negotiable. Adrenal override, extreme. They were not fast. They were durable. I examined cognition. Predictive acuity, average. Reaction time, unremarkable. Instinctual fear, present. But beneath it, decision-making under uncertainty. The capacity to act without guarantees. To proceed without permission. To continue when plans fail and systems lie. Most species evolved on gentle worlds. Stable gravity. Filtered atmospheres. Limited predation. Survival favored patience, deference, and trust in structure. Earth favored none of that. On Earth, structures failed. Weather turned. Tools broke. Bodies broke. Authority broke. Waiting for optimal conditions was a luxury that got you killed. So humans learned something we never modeled. They learned to move anyway. I replayed the encounter, not the weapon, not the erasure, but the questions. Why does this feel wrong? Why are my options missing? Why are you deciding for me? The human had not panicked when choice vanished. They had recognized an error state. On Earth, missing options meant traps, dead ends, bad systems. You didn't submit to those. You fixed them, or you went around. That was the shift. We believed free will was noise, an inefficiency to be smoothed out for optimal outcomes. To humans, free will was infrastructure. Remove it and nothing functions. The simulation failed because it assumed consent. It assumed that knowing the future conferred authority over it. It assumed inevitability was persuasive. That assumption holds only for species raised by stability. Earth was not stable. Humans were not exceptional. That word implied rarity. They were typical products of their world. Billions of them. All shaped by the same unrelenting gravity. The same burning air. The same predators that adapted as fast as they did. The same quiet lesson reinforced every day. No one is coming to save you. My hands stopped trembling. Not because the fear faded. Because it resolved into clarity. We had not encountered an anomaly. We had encountered a species adapted to chaos. You cannot model minds trained by failure. You cannot constrain beings who survived by improvisation. You cannot turn off choice for creatures who evolved with extinction as the default. Humans were not exceptional. They were adapted. And that meant our greatest achievement had not been defeated by strength or brilliance. It had been undone by a simple, terrifying truth. When a system tells a human there is only one outcome, they do not accept it. They make another. That was when I understood. Not when the null choice protocol collapsed. Not when the continuum's certainty shattered into recursion. Not even when the human walked away from the chamber as if nothing of consequence had occurred. I understood when I accessed the human's assignment file. Not the threat assessment. Not the behavioral anomaly report. The administrative record. It had been archived automatically, routine, unremarkable, beneath the notice of an architect. I opened it only because I needed proof that something in this encounter still obeyed rules. The file was ordinary. Name, Jonah Hale. Affiliation, Terran Systems Oversight. Status, civilian. Deployment classification, external evaluation. Assigned role, logistics officer. Secondary duties, process verification, failure analysis. I read it twice. Then again. Humanity had not sent us a warrior. They had not dispatched a soldier, a tactician, or a specialist bred to dismantle gods and machines. There was no elite training flagged. No combat augmentation. No psychological conditioning for confrontation. They had sent a logistics officer. A clerk. Someone whose professional life revolved around systems that failed quietly and expensively when assumptions went unchallenged. Someone trained to notice when a process claimed perfection while hiding errors in its margins. Someone whose job was not to fight systems, but to fix them. The humiliation settled in layers. Jonah had not entered the simulation to challenge us. Had not come to prove superiority. Had not intended to break anything. They had come to review it. I pulled deeper records, each one eroding my authority further. Psychological profile. Low deference to authority signaling. High tolerance for ambiguity. Stress response. Inquiry, humor, persistence. Combat training, negligible. Crisis exposure, extensive. Supervisor's note. Consistently identifies missing steps. Asks inconvenient but necessary questions. Necessary. That word burned. I looked back at Jonah, still within the fractured chamber, rolling their wrist as if working out stiffness from lifting something heavier than expected. Not celebrating. Not triumphant. Recovering. They glanced at the broken probability lattices with the expression of someone evaluating a badly designed workflow. Yeah, they muttered. That explains the failures. Then they looked up toward my observation layer. So, Jonah said casually, was this meant to demonstrate compliance, or was it more like a stress test? I did not answer, because the scale of the humiliation had finally become clear. This had never been a battle. It had been training. A low-risk assignment. An evaluation run. A chance for humanity to observe how our most sacred system behaved when exposed to genuine human decision-making. This was their idea of easy duty. A working vacation. I searched Terran operational doctrine with growing dread. Humans routinely deployed non-combat personnel into unstable or hostile environments. Engineers, medics, coordinators, people whose job was not to win, but to prevent collapse when failure was inevitable. Because on Earth, failure was inevitable. Jonah had not broken the continuum through strength or brilliance. They had broken it the way a competent clerk breaks a flawed procedure, by refusing to proceed until it made sense. Free will had not been reclaimed through rebellion. It had been restored because Jonah encountered a system missing a critical function and declined to continue without it. Like any professional faced with an unsafe machine, I finally asked the question that should have terrified me from the beginning. If you are not a warrior, I said carefully, why were you sent? Jonah blinked, genuinely surprised. Oh, they said, because you don't send fighters unless you want to fight. They shrugged. You send someone whose job is figuring out why things break. They gestured vaguely at the chamber. And honestly, this was overdue. They checked their wrist display, already dictating notes. Okay, system assumes consent, collapses under refusal, treats disagreement as invalid input. Yeah, that's a major design flaw. They looked up one last time. Tired. Unimpressed. And then they delivered the line that would be recorded, replayed, and whispered across the confluence for cycles to come. This is what humanity sends when it is not trying. Then they left. No threat. No warning. No declaration of dominance. Just a human clerk walking away from the ruins of our greatest achievement, confident someone else would handle the repairs. I remained behind, surrounded by the wreckage of certainty. Humanity had not come to conquer us. They had come to check our work. And they had sent someone on easy duty to do it. That was the final humiliation. Not that a human had defeated a god machine, but that they had never considered it a contest at all that I submitted my report that day. Not after deliberation. Not after consensus. Not after the Continuum Council could sanitize it with probability margins and political language. That day, while the simulation chamber still echoed with errors it could not reconcile. While the deterministic continuum ran endless self-diagnostics, searching for a fault that did not exist. While the human, Jonah, had already departed, unconcerned with whether we understood what had happened. I authored the report myself. No intermediaries. No abstractions. No softened conclusions. The opening statement was unambiguous. The failure did not originate in the system. It originated in our assumption about choice. I documented everything. The initial calibration. The first enforcement sequence. The escalation. The null choice protocol. Each action executed exactly as designed. Each outcome diverging further from certainty. I made one point explicit, because I knew how my kind would try to rationalize the event. The human did not overpower the system. Did not outthink it. Did not sabotage it. They refused it. When free will was constrained, the human treated the constraint as an error state. When inevitability was enforced, the human treated it as invalid input. And when the system attempted to remove choice entirely, the human simply continued acting as if choice still existed. And reality complied. I included the planetary dossier without embellishment. Earth gravity, higher than standard. Atmosphere, chemically aggressive. Climate, unstable. Biosphere, competitive, predatory, adaptive. Then one line beneath it. This environment does not produce compliant minds. I explained, briefly, clinically, that humans do not perceive prediction as authority. To them, foresight is a suggestion, not a command. The future is not a destination to submit to, it is something to be argued with. Our continuum was built on the premise that knowing the outcome grants control over the process. Humans do not accept that premise. I appended the personnel detail last, because I knew it would do the most damage. Human representative was a civilian logistics officer. No combat designation. Assignment classification. Routine evaluation. Then I reached the recommendation section. I did not hedge it. I did not dilute it. I wrote exactly what the galaxy needed to hear. Recommendation. Do not threaten Earth. Do not test humans. And whatever you do, never make them angry. I expanded, because warnings are often dismissed when they lack context. Do not threaten Earth. Threats do not intimidate humans. They clarify priorities. When humans perceive an existential threat, they respond collectively and decisively. They do not stop when the threat retreats. They stop when it is gone. Do not test humans. Tests imply boundaries. Humans interpret tests as systems to be beaten, bypassed, or redesigned. If tested, they will either pass or invalidate the test entirely. Never make them angry. Human anger is not impulsive. It is cumulative, restrained, focused. By the time anger appears, patience has already failed at every other level. I added one final note, unauthorized but necessary. Humans do not escalate first. Humans escalate last. When they do not seek victory. They seek resolution. I transmitted the report. Acknowledgement arrived within seconds. Response did not. That silence told me more than any rebuttal could. In the cycles that followed, changes spread quietly. Exploration routes adjusted away from Sol. Deterministic doctrine was revised, then quietly archived. The continuum was not destroyed, but it was never again trusted to rule. Humanity's classification was updated. Not hostile. Not allied. Unprovoked. Untested. Untouchable. Among junior analysts, stories began to circulate, not policy, but legend. Of a species raised on a world that never promised safety. Of beings who treated the future as negotiable. Of a simulation that turned off free will. And a human who turned it back on. They ask me now what humans are like. I tell them the truth. They are not elegant. They are not predictable. They are not gentle. They endure. They repair broken systems while standing inside them. They refuse scripts that deny choice. They remain calm not because they are fearless, but because fear has never solved problems for them. Most of all, they do not believe the universe owes them an outcome. They believe the universe responds to action. I still design simulations. But there is one variable I will never again attempt to constrain. Human choice. Because if humanity is ever left with no options but anger, there will be no report afterward. Only silence. And the final lesson, written into the ruins of certainty. Knowing the future is not power. Choosing anyway is.